The King of New Orleans. By Greg Klein. Watts and Company. William F. Watts was born in 1939 in Oklahoma City, and lived most of his life in the state of Oklahoma. He graduated from high school in Putnam City in 1957, and went to Oklahoma University on an athletic scholarship. By then he had already married his first wife, Pat, and had a child named Biff, but the marriage failed quickly. Like a lot of professional wrestlers who came from other athletic endeavors, Watts's college accomplishments have been greatly exaggerated over time. He was a good athlete in high school, and after a car accident in 1960 he started lifting weights and bulked up to more than 300 pounds. However, his sports accomplishments at Oklahoma University were few. The Oklahoma football team, under legendary coach Bud Wilkinson, didn't believe in weightlifting. It was a common misconception in sports in that era that lifting weights made you slower, and coaches preferred their athletes to be small and quick. Watts's normal weight prior to the accident had been about 240 pounds. He claimed the football team wanted him to be about 200 pounds. When he came back as an upperclassman all bulked up, they didn't know what to do with him, so he left Oklahoma for pro football. Watts signed a contract with the Houston Oilers in their second year in the AFL, but he didn't make the team. At Oklahoma, Watts had trouble with the college football system and the discipline the coaches demanded. Anyone who wrestled for him later in Mid-South or other groups will no doubt find great irony in that idea. Watts having trouble with an authority figure who demanded discipline. However, as a young man, he certainly fought authority and lacked a certain amount of discipline himself. Although Wilkinson was beloved in Oklahoma for winning national championships, he ran a boot camp-like training program for football, similar to the kind of system Bear Bryant is famously portrayed as employing at Texas A&M and the Junction Boys. In his book The Cowboy and the Cross, Watts wrote, "All of these young men were brutalized for a game, and it was endorsed by an institution of higher learning, with the survivors being given icon status instead of the perpetrators being disciplined. Is that sick or what?" Wilkinson also believed that coaches shouldn't fraternize with their players. Watts said he found himself so far removed from his coach that Wilkinson didn't even know when Watts was getting into trouble outside of college. Almost from the beginning, he did get into a lot of trouble. Later in life, Watts found Christ, and is quite candid about his faults and sins during that era. Simply put, he had an explosive temper. He was a bully who hurt a lot of people, many of whom, perhaps most of whom, did not deserve it. Even the ones who deserved his ire probably did not deserve the vicious beatings he became known for giving out. The reputation as a bully would follow him into wrestling, especially in his life as a promoter, right up until his final days in the sport. Watts is also quite candid about his years of drinking and philandering. He married his first wife when she became pregnant, ruined his second marriage, and hurt his relationships with his children because of his cheating. He is currently married to his fourth wife, Suzanne. When Suzanne asked about his marriage to his second wife, Ine, and why they got divorced after 26 years, he responded, "It was my fault, because I was a whore." Even in his professional career, Watts had trouble. His stint at the Oilers training camp may have ended with him being cut anyway, but he also punched an assistant coach while he was there. With his personal and professional lives in chaos, Watts was helped by the close-knit world of Oklahoma athletes, men who had made the transition into professional wrestling. Jack Briscoe, a champion wrestler at rival Oklahoma State, had started his rise to the top of the wrestling business and often told Watts he would do well at it, too. Oklahoma football star Wahoo McDaniel, who also had success in the pro football ranks, made the transition to the ring, as well. In late 1962, Watts and McDaniel were out drinking one night, and McDaniel pulled out a check and showed it to his friend. "I don't remember how much it was, but it must have been a couple grand," Watts said. "I asked him where he got it, and he said, 'I got it for wrestling.' The check was so big, Watts assumed it was for a week or even a month of work." McDaniel stunned Watts when he revealed that the check was for just one match. Watts had never been a fan of pro wrestling growing up, because he thought it wasn't real, but when he saw the check, he, too, realized the money was real. McDaniel made some calls, and Watts soon had a tryout for Oklahoma promoter Leroy McGuirk. McGuirk had been the NWA World Junior Heavyweight Champion, so he promoted a territory full of junior heavyweights. His star was Danny Hodge, who may have been the toughest man in wrestling ever, despite the fact that he was smaller than most wrestlers. At the least, he had a legendary grip, a vice-like lock that no one could break. Hodge was the longtime reigning champion in the division, which McGuirk booked and largely controlled. Naturally, Watts stuck out in such a promotion. His size eventually helped him get over in Oklahoma, as it did everywhere, but in the beginning McGuirk simply had no use for him. Instead, McDaniel got Watts booked into Indianapolis. From there, Watts slowly made the rounds. He worked for Dory Funk Sr. in Amarillo, Morris Siegel in Houston, Jules Strongbow in Los Angeles, Ed McLemore in Dallas, and then began appearing back home for McGuirk, as well. With his size, his aggression, and his amateur wrestling skills, he did well everywhere he went, although he continued to have issues outside the ring. In 1964, Watts got the first of many big breaks in his career when he was called up to New York to work for Vince J. McMahon and his partner at the time, Toots Mott. Besides his first sustained run as a headliner, Watts also renewed acquaintances with Ine, whom he would later marry. Ine had a son named Joel from her first marriage, and she and Watts would have 3 more kids, Erich, Micah, and Ine. After nearly 2 years in New York, and having been made a main event attraction, Watts wrestled for Roy Shire in San Francisco and Vern Gagne in the Midwest. Shire had taken a territory that had been dead and turned it into a hotbed of wrestling. Watts would later do the same thing with Mid-South. After a brief period where he left wrestling to work in direct marketing, Watts moved on to Vern Gagne's Midwest territory, the American Wrestling Association. Gagne won an NCAA wrestling title at Minnesota and represented the United States at the Olympics. He used his success to promote himself into a top-flight pro wrestler, as well. When the NWA cartel didn't make him champion, Gagne claimed his own world title and built his territory into a powerhouse. He thrived, at least initially, on personal associations outside of wrestling, networking his way into powerful alliances with the business leaders and television station managers who could make his promotion successful or cause its demise. Working for Shire and Gagne helped Watts' transition toward being a promoter. Each was a genius in his own way, each was successful, and each had giant flaws that would end up dooming their promotions in the ensuing decades, Shire in the 70s and Gagne in the 80s. Some of the influence they had on Watts was positive, but many of the things they taught him were negative. The experiences would pay quick dividends. Soon enough, Watts had the opportunity to put his knowledge to good use. In 1970, McGuirk called Watts back to Oklahoma to help solve the problems in the territory. In a sense, he had lost control of the business, and his bookers and workers were running the show. Egos were taking precedence over business, which was a common problem in wrestling, as evidenced by the decline of the NWA in the 80s, World Championship Wrestling (WCW) in the 90s, and the more recent struggles of Total Nonstop Action Wrestling (TNA). McGuirk didn't totally trust Watts, so he set up a deal where Gagne and Fritz von Erich, a new Dallas promoter and a national headliner who used a Nazi gimmick, bought into the partnership. As the star of the territory, Yanni Hodge got a percentage, as well. Hodge, Gagne, and von Erich were largely silent partners, an arrangement common in the NWA cartel. Watts, however, had no intention of being silent. Returning to Oklahoma after 6 years on top in the best territories was a step down for him. Only owning part of the territory could make up for all the other issues. I've been excited about my first experience as a part owner, but Oklahoma was nothing but problems, he wrote. The weather was horrible, the trips were horrible, and the office politics were horrible. McGuirk had lost the sight in one of his eyes early in his life because of a childhood disease. Despite his handicap, he excelled at amateur wrestling, and went to Oklahoma State, then known as Oklahoma A&M, where he won 2 NCAA wrestling titles. He was also editor of the college newspaper. His transition into professional wrestling had been smooth. He reigned over the junior heavyweight division in the years before Hodge, and held the NWA title on and off for nearly 2 decades. His career ended tragically when he lost the sight in his other eye in a bar fight. McGuirk was sucker punched while sticking up for another wrestler, took shards of glass in his eye, and lost his vision. In wrestling, the loss of a second eye was always blamed on a car accident to avoid insinuating that a wrestler could lose a fight. It was one of those stigmas promoters had. Watts himself would fire wrestlers for losing bar fights. McGuirk reacted to the loss of his vision, and his wrestling career with what would now be diagnosed as depression. Watts and several other sources describe McGuirk as alcoholic and moody. I tried to treat him as a father figure, Watts wrote, but I never knew where I stood with him. In the office, Watts found McGuirk to be the voice of negativity, always tearing down ideas, always pessimistic about the prospects for success. In a pattern that's typical of an entrenched promotion in decline, there were many cronies, or stooges in wrestling terms, in McGuirk's office whose careers and lifestyles depended on keeping the status quo. They were anti-Watts from the beginning. Watts said he felt like he had to rid the promotion of the rats and backstabbers to get anything accomplished. He would book the wrestlers who were junior heavyweights to beat Hodge. Hodge would then take his fury out on them in a series of rematches, and the stooges would wisely decide that there were better ways to make a living in wrestling. Watts would run others off by burying them, and since it was Watts, a few probably got the point through bullying, as well. The roster did improve, and Gagne and Von Erich sent in some talent to replace the dead weight. It was during this period that Watts first began pushing Dale Hay, the wrestler who would become so important to him in the 80s, as Buddy Roberts of the Fabulous Freebirds. It was also in this era that Watts moved the television tapings to Shreveport, where they would stay throughout the Mid-South era. Originally, Watts did this to get away from a television announcer he disliked named Danny Williams. Watts said he felt Williams tried too hard to make himself the star of the show, something he hated in announcers. Since Williams worked for the Oklahoma City television station that filmed the show, the shift to Shreveport took the tapings out of Williams's domain. It also introduced Boyd Pierce to the mix. Pierce, the flamboyant, corny, country-as-hell Louisiana native, would become a fixture on Mid-South wrestling. He made the wrestlers and the matches the stars of the show, which Watts felt added credibility to the action. At about the same time Watts took part ownership of Tri-State, he got an interview with the NWA board to be world champion. The reigning champ, Gene Kiniski, had been on top for 4 years, a length of time that as a touring champion must have felt like dog years. The champ went all over the country, and at times the world, for something like 300 matches a year. Many of these matches were what were called Broadways, or time-limit draws, often 60 or 90 minutes long. Above all, the champ was tasked with making the local heroes look good so the fans would believe a title change was coming, and buy tickets to see it. In reality, title changes were rare in that era. A good champ, however, made it look like just the opposite. Not only did he make the fan favorite look like a world beater, he made him look that way even if he was a clod, or a green boy, or the promoter's son. Once, around 1985, NWA champ Ric Flair was set to defend against Kerry Von Erich, only no one could find Von Erich. When they did find him, he was passed out in a drug-fueled stupor. They woke him, sent him out for the main event while he was still in his stupor, and Flair still made him look like a world beater. That was the champion's job. Watts had other ideas, however. He wanted to be put over, or win, in strong fashion, during his initial foray into each territory. That way, when he finally had to sell for the local hero, everyone would know how tough the champion was. He didn't want to do Broadways, at least of the 60 or 90-minute variety. As he would later say about JYD, he wasn't getting paid by the hour. Plus, Watts knew that he didn't have the fortitude to do 60-minute matches night after night. The NWA interview didn't go well. On top of that, many of the board members felt that, because of his size, Watts wouldn't look beatable next to the often smaller stars. Watts ended up getting just one vote, McGuirk's. The title went to Dory Funk Jr., and he, too, had a 4-year run with the belt. Watts immersed himself in his duties as owner/wrestler, but life with McGuirk was hard. Even overcoming the wave of cronies wasn't enough. The top guy wasn't going anywhere, and Watts's ideas about business just didn't match with McGuirk's. According to Watts, McGuirk even wanted to do the announcing. How a blind man could announce what he saw in the ring is one of the great mysteries of wrestling. Still, until Watts came along, no one would tell McGuirk that it was a bad idea. Ultimately, the negativity and the constant infighting got to be too much. In 1972, Florida promoter Eddie Graham, who would become one of Watts's closest friends in wrestling, asked Watts to work the Georgia territory. The NWA had a promotional war raging in Georgia. Graham was a shareholder in the Georgia office, and he told Watts he needed his help. Eager to be out of the battle in his own promotion, Watts jumped at the chance. Soon enough, he had Georgia on his mind. At first, Graham was just calling in talent to oppose an outlaw group in a squabble over the territory. Georgia co-owner Ray Gunkel had kicked his partners out and formed his own group in 1972, at least that had been his intention before he had a heart attack during a match and died in a locker room in Savannah. His widow, Ann, continued with the plans to take over the territory. The NWA cartel lined up against her. All of the local talent went with Gunkel except Bob Armstrong. Since Graham promoted Florida, he had extensive contacts and friendships with the ousted promoters. He also worried that if the Outlaws succeeded in Georgia, they would expand into his territory next. He was the point man on the war, calling in talent like Watts to run against the opposition cards. The NWA group technically owned the television contract on WTBS, then just Channel 17, not yet the cable outlet. But Ann Gunkel had some pull with Ted Turner. The wrestling business being the wrestling business, there was a lot of talk about what kind of pull she had. In any event, WTBS wound up airing both promotions back-to-back, out of the same studio, and getting great ratings for both shows. The war moved to the arenas. Watts came in for a television taping. The card was loaded with NWA stars who were huge in their own territories but unknown in Georgia. He had been booked to beat Armstrong, but when he saw the reaction Armstrong got from the fans, he changed the finish mid-match and told Armstrong to beat him. Graham had made Jack Briscoe into a star, and Briscoe had been telling Graham to keep an eye on his fellow Okie. "The guy you need to get down here is Bill Watts," Watts credits Briscoe with telling Graham. Graham was convinced by Briscoe's sell job, as well as Watts's immediate understanding of the Georgia situation, and his in-ring ad-lib with Armstrong. Graham flew Watts to Florida to watch his operation, and his opinion of Watts increased. In the end, Graham offered Watts a booking job in Florida, to start immediately after he helped clean up the mess in Georgia. Eager to get away from McGuirk, Watts agreed. As part of the deal, he became a shareholder in Florida, as well. The war lasted a couple of years. Gunkel's charm helped her hang on, but she eventually filed an antitrust lawsuit and closed down. By then, Watts had moved into Florida, where he claims he really learned the business. He learned or improved upon his ability to make stars. For example, Watts had a hand in turning Dusty Rhodes babyface and into one of the hottest acts in the country. He helped turn Graham's young talent into budding stars, guys like Dick Slater, Paul Orndorff, and Graham's own son, Mike. He learned about booking for venues where the promotion ran every week, as Florida did in Tampa and Watts would one day do in New Orleans. He also expanded into a second circuit to help maximize profits. Graham preached credibility, from the action to the announcers, a philosophy that Watts would adopt as his own. Graham had been one of the pioneers of the Super Show, where every match was of main event caliber, or at least a big blow-off to a hot feud, to maximize crowds for special events. Of course, this philosophy would lead to the Superdome spectaculars. Florida was a great territory in its day and an excellent place to learn. The only downside, as was always the case with wrestling, was the toll it took on family life. At first, Watts tried to keep his family home and visit on the weekends. And he brought them along. But Ine Watts grew tired of Florida, so she headed back to Oklahoma, and her husband was not far behind. In the end, he'd learned the business from Graham, a crusty old high school dropout who would destroy himself with alcohol debts. And, after his territory fell apart in the 80s wrestling war, suicide. He always used to ask, Watts wrote, "You're a college man. Why are you here working for me, a high school dropout?" I always told him, I came to get my PhD in wrestling. In 1975, Watts was back in Tri-State, where he set about putting his house in order. He bought out von Erich and Gagne, insisted on the promotion keeping professional books. McGuirk had run Tri-State out of his back pocket, and began making things right with McGuirk, as well. When Dick Murdoch's star began to rise, Watts learned the hard way about the curse of the booker's ego. Watts was used to being the top star, so he almost cut Murdoch off at the knees. However, unlike Rhodes and many other bookers and promoters, Watts looked at the situation with unbiased eyes and instead cut back on his own push. By 1980 he would be semi-retired, with only a few big comebacks. Like most, he probably came back one time too many. However, in 1975 he was riding high on promoting, and by 1976 he would promote his first Superdome show. The success should have thrilled McGuirk, but it only seemed to make him angrier. After the 1978 Superdome show, headlined by Ernie Ladd vs. Ray Candy, when McGuirk uttered his infamous racial slur against his own promotion, and the crowd it had drawn, Watts and their lieutenants were shocked. After Grizzly Smith defended the crowd's color by pointing out that their money was green, Watts jumped in with his own defense. "Leroy, this was the biggest gate we've ever drawn," he said. "It puts us on the map as a major promotion." In response, McGuirk only repeated his slurs. Worse, Ladd had actually been in the room listening. He tiptoed out and then re-entered loudly. At that point, McGuirk changed his demeanor and reportedly gave Ladd a warm greeting and a hug, no doubt congratulating him on the big success in New Orleans. Ladd never let on that he had heard the earlier conversation. Of course, it was Ernie Ladd, a monster of a man who was well versed in turning the other cheek. Unlike most football players who became wrestlers, Ladd had been a legitimate star as a defensive lineman, first at Grambling State for legendary coach Eddie Robinson, and then for the Sid Gilman's San Diego Chargers in the 60s. He played in 3 AFL title games, winning the championship in 1963. He was a 4-time AFL All-Star and a 3-time Media All-Pro. Nicknamed the Big Cat because of his amazing speed for a man of his size, 6 feet 9 inches and more than 300 pounds, he was a giant of his time, and had 2 tall Jones of a different era. He played 5 years for the Chargers, 1 for the Oilers, and 1 for the Chiefs before injuries ended his career. He spent a couple more seasons on the Chiefs' injured reserve list, including 1967-68, when the team made the first Super Bowl. He was later inducted into the Louisiana Sports Hall of Fame and the San Diego Chargers Hall of Fame. JYD takes Jake the Snake Roberts to the mat with a Russian leg sweep. After his first year of pro football, Ladd began wrestling, at first just in the off-season. He started as part of a publicity stunt in which members of the San Diego wrestling group challenged members of the Chargers. Ladd responded, and showed instant ability. He went to work for the Los Angeles promotion, and his size and interview skills made him an immediate star. Soon, he spent his off-seasons going on the road to various territories. He was a menacing black giant who was good for drawing heat against the smaller white babyfaces who would overcome the odds to battle back and defeat him. Or in southern promotions where blacks and whites were often barred from competing against each another, he was the perfect foil for Bobo Brazil, the biggest black star and one of the most popular wrestlers of the era. Ladd made so much money in wrestling that he eventually gave up football altogether. Brazil is sometimes called the Jackie Robinson of wrestling for his role in the integration of the sport. If that's true, then Ladd was the Larry Doby, the Cleveland Indian who integrated the American League and who is often forgotten in the many tributes to Robinson. Ladd endured as much as his more famous counterpart. Perhaps because he was the heel in a sport known to induce violent reactions from its fans, Ladd endured even more rage than the crowd-pleasing Brazil. It wasn't just from fans, either. It came from promoters like McGuirk, and even other wrestlers. Watts remembered one incident that occurred just after Lyndon Johnson signed the landmark Civil Rights Act. In a Baltimore locker room, a journeyman named Don McClarity said to Ladd, with Brazil sitting there, too, "I don't care what the president says," and then proceeded to call Ladd that word. Watts thought Ladd was going to kill the smaller wrestler. But Ernie was thinking so much further ahead than anyone. He was making huge money and he wasn't going to lose it over a dressing room brawl. Instead, Ladd focused on the green, working as a main event wrestler all over the country. Like Watts, he had a great run in the Northeast. With his size and strength, he made a perfect foil for the muscle man Bruno Sammartino. He also had a lengthy run with Andre the Giant. As one of the few wrestlers who could match Andre's size, Andre was billed as 7 feet 5 inches, but in reality he was a tad under 7 feet. Ladd was a natural against the Giant. They didn't just fight in the Northeast, they made the circuit, with Ladd following Andre to any booking where there was no natural opponent. Eventually, they would bring the feud to Mid-South, as well. By the mid-70s, Ladd had settled into Tri-State, where he could headline close to his Louisiana home. His friendship with Watts grew during this period, and his mind for wrestling helped him take a role in the office. It was Ladd who shaped the feud with Ray Candy that first lit up the Dome. Watts, in fact, resisted the matchup, because he didn't believe in Candy as a headliner. However, he trusted Ladd, and ultimately gave in to the idea. When he started with us, we put him over like a killer, and he was really getting over with the people, Watts said. He came to me one day with an idea for him to work with Ray Candy. I said, "Shit, it won't draw." He said, "Trust me, it will draw." He finally talked me into it. And he told me his idea was to have Candy beat him on TV to start the thing. I said, "Ernie, you have got to be nuts. I worked my ass off to get you over here, and Ray Candy's going to beat you?" Of course, Ladd's idea paid off with the July 22, 1978, Superdome match, which drew 23,800 fans. Race, however, was still a tough subject, especially in the South, and it was clearly a dividing line, even in the Tri-State office. The Superdome match might not have been the exact point that Watts decided to break away from McGuirk, but it wasn't far from it, either. Watts still didn't believe in Ray Candy in the long term, but both he and Ladd knew they could go a long way with a black star at the top of the promotion. McGuirk certainly wasn't going to go along with that. In the end, there was more than one issue that led Watts to break away. Many would laugh at the idea of the abrasive Watts being put off by a person as negative as McGuirk, but Watts did, indeed, dislike the constant flow of negativity from his partner. Whether it was the blindness, the alcohol issues from his childhood, or just the typical bitterness that often developed in a wrestler who was past his prime and losing his grip on the business, McGuirk wasn't a happy person. Watts has been called many nasty things by his former employees and others in the business. Jake Roberts, who did several tours in Mid-South followed by one controversial stint with Watts in WCW, has said that when Watts dies there will be a long line of wrestlers waiting to piss on his grave. That may be true. Watts has been called a screamer, a disciplinarian, a bully even. In WCW, in one of his final stints in wrestling, Watts was a bad fit with the corporate culture of Ted Turner's company. There are legendary stories of him cussing like a sailor, pissing off the office building into the parking lot, and smoking joints on his balcony. It may even be true that McGuirk's bad temper and negativity served as a mirror for Watts, who couldn't stand seeing his own negative traits reflected. Whatever the case, Watts and McGuirk could no longer coexist. In 1979, Watts was coming into his own as a promoter. He was well trained and had great enthusiasm for his new position in the business and his future plans for the promotion. Finally, he told his partner that he planned to go it alone. McGuirk filed a lawsuit, alleging that Watts had been embezzling funds from the company. However, McGuirk and his wife had kept the books, so it was a hard case to prove. Instead, Watts and McGuirk worked out a deal that let Tri-State keep Oklahoma and Arkansas, which had been the best parts of the territory. All Watts wanted in return was New Orleans. Of course, the Louisiana State Athletic Commission had a say in that. Chairman Emile Bruneau tried to get the two partners back together to settle their differences, but when McGuirk failed to show up at several planned meetings, Bruneau gave Watts the license to promote shows in Louisiana. With that, Mid-South Wrestling was born. McGuirk's half of the business floundered. He hired George Scott from the Carolinas. Scott earned a good reputation as a booker during a hot period in the 70s, but in some ways he had simply been handed a great formula and great talent. He didn't have a Johnny Valentine in Oklahoma, and he didn't have a history of tag team wars to work with, either. Instead, he had a fading junior heavyweight division, with no stars, in a tough area to travel. He didn't have a stable of wrestlers in Oklahoma City who homesteaded, like in Charlotte, men who also happened to be some of the best workers in the business. Like Watts, he wasn't going to get the biggest stars in wrestling, he was going to have to create stars to keep the business successful. Unlike Watts, however, Scott wasn't able to succeed. In fact, from about 1980 on, George Scott seemed like the type of old guard booker the business had passed by. Tri-State was just the first of his failures. Meanwhile, Louisiana was the hot part of the old Tri-State region, thanks to Watts and his team. By 1982, Mid-South had bought out McGuirk and controlled Oklahoma and Arkansas, as well. With JYD's success, Watts expanded into Texas, including the huge Houston market, throughout Mississippi, and occasionally back into corners of Kansas and Missouri. But before he was able to do that, he had to sign or create a black superstar to give his fans what they wanted. The opposition, not from rival promoters, but from society in general, was at times fierce. Inside the business, people assumed Mid-South would fail. Instead, it had a historic run on top. In reality, the heyday of New Orleans wrestling only lasted half a decade, from 1979 until 1984. But it was a great time for wrestling and for New Orleans.